18 years and one day to the date of the U.S. led, of course, UK was involved, a number of other countries. Invasion of Iraq obviously took place on March 19th, 2003, and we're revisiting this today. And I'd like to actually talk about the title a little bit in the volumes you mentioned that we're going to be reading from. As you can see, the title here is Iraq War 18th anniversary, Clean Break, Israel Lobby, Politics of Oil. And what that means basically is you mentioned the Clean Break document. It's very interesting because one of the things we've tried to do with our program, I mean, anybody who can go check out our YouTube channel can find, we did a 5-part series from 9/11 to 11/9, and that is basically tracking the events of September 11th, trying to make sense of some of the aspects of the questions surrounding it and et cetera, connecting that to what we call the 11/9 operation, which is the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And many of the same players who at the very deep levels were involved with aspects of the September 11th operation itself, certainly the post 9/11 wars, both from a Middle Eastern perspective as well as more domestically closer to home in the Western world, particularly in Europe, this idea of not just a war against these Muslim countries, Islamic countries, but actually a clash of civilizations, as it's called, where you have a strategy of tension set up with regards to Europe and the West in general. And so between like the Judeo-Christian West, as they call it, and the combination forces of like whatever enemy of the moment, but there's a major Islamic component to that, to what's being shaped here. So anyway, we did that 3-part, we did a 5-part series on that, and one of the major things to understand that we've continued to emphasize is the Clean Break document. Because when you think about the war in Iraq, people think about the Project for New American Century, which was the William Crystal, Reagan-led think tank, basically, which launched the Rebuilding America's Defenses, which mentioned combination of things such as a cataclysmic event such as the new Pearl Harbor, combined with the need to bring democracy to the Middle East in the aftermath of such an event. And people associate that, and that's very much a theme within the idea of like the Republican hawks being opposed to Donald Trump. But outside of that, you've got Building America's Defenses. You've also got the Wesley Clark quote that's pretty well known among like serious policy people, researchers, I would say, of where he was told by people within the Pentagon. I believe he's referring to the types of people we're talking about now, that we're going to be talking about here, of the plan to invade basically and overthrow 7 countries in 5 years. And so people are pretty familiar with that. I believe the countries were Iraq, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Somalia, and I'm forgetting one, but Iran being the final.
Libya, maybe?
Yes, but 7 countries in 5 years. So people think of those. But then you've got this whole other aspect, which is a whole other group of what you might call neocon hawks. And these are people who, as opposed to like these William Crystal types, very, very much were supportive of the Donald Trump candidacy and presidency. And these are the people who I think at the deepest levels, what we're going to talk about is mindset through one of the major names of the Clean Break operation is a man by the name of David Wormser. And as far as I would say the really serious propaganda, the fake intelligence, which led to the justification to go into Iraq, was largely implemented and put in place by a group of people with close proximity to Vice President Dick Cheney. David Wormser is architect of this Clean Break paper, along with a man by the name of Douglas Feith. And there are others as well, but those two particularly within what was called the Office for Special Plans. And a lot of the faulty intelligence that led to Iraq largely came out of this, as far as a combination of, and not even so much even the weapons of mass destruction lies, attempting to link Iraq to things such as anthrax, such as terrorism in general. And so when we say clean break, that's an important one because that is an important component of the global war on terror that is not focused on as much as some of the other aspects. And then as far as the Israel lobby goes, it's very important to understand the role of Israel the Israel lobby in terms of the American U.S. Israel lobbies. We're going to talk about the book by Walt and Mearsheimer. The book from 2006, and the role of this in terms of, you can even go and read in the pages of Haaretz, the more liberal Israeli publication of the, I believe the quote was quoting, wasn't it Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, where if you, of the architects of the Iraq war, you could basically go down you have the quote, Jeremy? You know what I'm referring to, right?
Yeah, I don't have the quote, but it was a group of 25 people who, if they were not present in D.C., the Iraq war would not have happened or something like that.
Yes. And so and that's the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman referring to primarily Jewish American neoconservatives in this small proximate area in reference. And so,
you're right though, Greg, that it's interesting that it was in Haaretz. It wasn't an American newspaper. It was in an Israeli newspaper, and one of the most journalistic of the Israeli newspapers, especially if you're interested in aspects of Israeli cyber and its link to Israeli military intelligence. Haaretz actually has done a lot of interesting long-form journalism there. But it's interesting that Friedman is not on the record saying such a thing in an American press context.
Indeed. And so anyway, Israel lobbyists, we're going to read from the book by Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, excerpts. Very important in terms of I would say in terms of an operation such as the Iraq War, in terms of getting enough bipartisan support for the Iraq War, because the American Israel lobby was very strongly pushing for it as a means of advancing interest in the post 9/11 world in terms related to a number of things. And Benjamin Netanyahu, who we might talk about more in this, current prime minister of Israel, lobbied very hard for the U.S. to enter Iraq, even in front of a congressional panel, the need to go in. And there's about a 2.5 hour video. I believe it's from late 2002, where Netanyahu's testifying and telling all the reasons why the U.S. needs to go into Iraq and why it's so essential for the world. Of course, this is the same man who was caught saying basically that that Israel was benefiting from the events of September 11th. And so,
but it's interesting also, Greg, that was supposed to be a panel of different Israeli opinions around the Iraq war. And it was only Netanyahu, pointing to that in similar fashion around aspects of the Iran deal, where there are actually internal Israeli national security differences at certain levels, in terms of those that might actually be interested in what you might call defensive Israeli national security, rather than remaking the Middle East and these clean break wars, or that also trace back to the Oded Yinon paper of the 1980s, which will be in the background here, that none of those people were given a seat at the table to brief Congress about the potential multiplicity of Israeli views. No, it was only Benjamin Netanyahu who was going to basically browbeat Congress into why they had to do this.
And that's a very important point. I'm glad you mentioned that with regards to Netanyahu, because what you'll find is that even talking about Israel, yes, there's a domestic Israel lobby. There's a lot of influence in terms of our Congress and in terms of shaping support for such an operation in Iraq. But at the same time, it's more or less, it looks like just as much here with the U.S. with a very specific group of hawks here in the United States that pushed so hard for this. It's a very specific, more or less it's a very specific group, even within the establishment of the state of Israel, that was pushing for this as well. And you'll see this continue to over time in terms of the push for the most hardline of the propaganda against Iran will come from a specific set around people like a Benjamin Netanyahu and like-minded people. So that's an important distinguisher, even when you say in terms of Israel. It's particularly there's a particular component within the Israeli establishment pushing for these pushing the hardest for these operations. And so we'll get into the Israel lobby aspect. Then the last part of this title is the politics of oil. And that leads to, obviously, when people think of the war in Iraq, you think of oil. I mean, the standard line is Iraq was a war for oil. And so, yes, I would agree with that. To a large extent, Iraq war was a war for oil, but I don't think it was a war for oil in the way it was widely interpreted by a lot of people. Whereas the idea of Iraq was being a war for oil was a war just simply for like American oil interest or whatever, when it appears to me more and more that a lot of actual American oriented oil interests they really didn't benefit all that much from war in the Middle East. Whereas but when you refer to oil, you have to think of somebody like Dick Cheney and a company such as Halliburton, Kellogg Brown Root, which did benefit from, of course, Dick Cheney being in the vice president's office, did benefit from wars in the Middle East, combined with what we're going to talk about, excerpts from a book by man by the name of Gary Vogler, who was in the inside during aspects of the lead up to this to the launching of the war in Iraq, titled Iraq and the Politics of Oil. So we'll get into that, and we'll talk about where there are oil interests, certainly within the Cheney element, as well as what we're going to discuss when it comes to this book. And so, Iraq very much a war for oil. I just don't think it's as much in like the traditional sense of simply benefiting like American big oil companies. So we'll get into all of that here, but that's basically what we're going to discuss, a combination of Iraq as it relates to this clean break document, as it relates to making sense of the role of the very, very influential American domestic Israel lobby, which also, if you think about it, then it goes outside of just simply Congress itself. You could go into aspects of media, and you could go into aspects and certainly think tankery, as we're going to discuss with some of these hardliners that will go back into interrelated with the clean break document. And then the politics of oil is where we see the actual serious oil interests being represented that definitely were at the core of benefiting from this catastrophic, ill-fated, to say the least, military endeavor in Iraq that 18 years in one day from today. So we'll get into all that here.
Yeah, and that's the first thing that should be said, is that the reason that this is important to discuss is because of, any single, what you might call, international act or foreign policy act from an American perspective. It's hard to think of a more immoral in terms of its end result and criminal in terms of what it was proposed upon, in terms of that this was, as the British, eventually exposed, that the intelligence was being framed around the policy, rather than that this was a policy decision based on intelligence. And then the ultimate results of this are so destructive in terms of human lives, most obviously Iraqi human lives, and in so many different ways, really, not only the immediate death and destruction that happens anytime there's invasion and war, but also in terms of the destruction of cultural institutions, certain aspects even of political networks that were necessary for Iraq to rebuild in a political fashion. Because, of course, no one, this is the non sequitur that's always made. You saying that, you're defending Saddam Hussein. No, that's not the point. The point is, what was the actual reason and result for this mass immoral act? And that's on the Iraqi side of things. But it's also can be seen that it was the most devastating act from an American perspective too, including the American military casualties. That's not only deaths, that's also tons, dozens of thousands of people maimed, but also then the evident psychological wake of that unjust war, where it comes home to roost, not only even American in a domestic political fashion, but psychologically for veterans. And you look up the rates of suicide that American veterans have, been suffering at, especially in this 21st century, post 9/11, especially post Iraq War era. And it begins adding up into well over 100,000 casualties after the fact, if you think about it in that way. And then, of course, everyone rational and reasonable and moral understands that the Iraq War was one of the worst foreign policy acts that the United States government has ever done. Definitely of the 21st century. And obviously the wound is still actively lingering across the board there. So that's why it continues to be important to talk about the Iraq War and its origins on a human ground level, and then also at a national security level. But the reason why we chose these texts out of the list of texts that we have listed under Antidote Deep Core texts is because it's this piece. And we're not asserting that it's the only motivation here, but we're saying it's a central motivation, and it's the motivation in terms of these political networks, the things that are not talked about. It has not yet been, as far as I know, it has not really been talked about in a significant fashion in many even anti-war left networks. And so we think that it's important to go to the core of the texts. And these are, well sussed out texts. These are based on reasonable analysis, grounded in facts that can be checked. And when you put the pieces together, it's a very damning picture, especially in relationship to how much silence there is in terms of how compelling the textual historical evidence is around this. Okay. So, all right. So first up is The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. And the book was published in 2007, but it's based on an article that they put out in 2006. And at first there was suppression of it. It was hard for them to get it out, but then they eventually got it out, and then there was not discussion of it. And then eventually there was discussion.
Interestingly enough, Jeremy, I believe once again it was where it was supposed to be published in an American leading American monthly publication, the Atlantic Monthly, and then the Atlantic Monthly basically the editor determined that would not publish it. So basically, once again, we talked about how it was Israeli Haaretz that published that Thomas Friedman quote about being able to find the architects of the war within this short radius. Very similar to that, I believe it was a foreign publication, the London Review of Books, that published the essay that led to the book, The Israel Lobby. So,
yes, I think you're exactly right, Greg. All right, so we'll first read from The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. And then if anybody wants to make a comment or a question, we can open it up then, but there's no pressure to. All right, here we go. This is what's very interesting is this. We're going to read from chapter 8, which is titled Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. But right before that is chapter 7, which is titled The Lobby versus the Palestinians. Okay, and so there's a very important bookend, I think, to that, and eventually we will go back to that chapter, because that's actually crucial to understand even the bigger framework, not only of the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which another one of the books on our list, State of Terror, by Thomas Suarez. Basically, the very first thing he points out is that the use of the terminology of the Israeli-Palestinian quote-unquote conflict has already been fully debunked by something like the American Anthropologists Association, because it destabilizes and it paints over the real meaning of the differential of power there. But I just wanted to point that out, that's sort of framing the background here. And then that chapter also gives some perspective about the larger interest of the Israel Lobby in the war on terror, I think. Okay. So chapter 8 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. Quote, why did the United States invade Iraq? In The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, George Packer declares that, quote, it still isn't possible to be sure, and this remains the most remarkable thing about the Iraq War, unquote. He quotes Richard Haas, the director of policy planning in the State Department during Bush's first term, and now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, saying that he would, quote, go to his grave not knowing the answer, unquote. In one sense, their uncertainty is understandable because the decision to overthrow Saddam Hussein even now seems difficult to fathom. He was clearly a brutal tyrant with worrisome ambitions, including a desire to obtain WMD, but his own incompetence had put these dangerous objectives out of reach. His army had been routed in the 1991 Gulf War and further weakened by a decade of UN sanctions. As a result, Iraq's military power, never impressive except on paper, was a pushover by 2003. Intrusive UN inspections had eliminated Iraq's nuclear program and eventually led Saddam to destroy his biological and chemical weapons stockpiles as well. There were no convincing links between Saddam and Osama bin Laden, who were in fact hostile to each other, and bin Laden and his associates were in Afghanistan or Pakistan, not Iraq. Yet in the aftermath of 9/11, when one would have expected the United States to be focusing laser-like on al-Qaeda, the Bush administration chose to invade a deteriorating country that had nothing to do with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and was already effectively contained. From this perspective, it is a deeply puzzling decision. From another angle, however, the decision is not that hard to understand. The United States was the world's most powerful country, and there was never any doubt about its ability to oust Saddam if it so chose. The United States had not only won the long Cold War, it had also enjoyed a remarkable run of military successes after 1989, defeating Iraq handily in 1991, halting the Balkan bloodletting in 1995, and beating Serbia in 1999. The rapid ouster of the Taliban in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 reinforced an image of military invincibility and made it harder for skeptics on Iraq to convince others that going to war was unnecessary and unwise. Americans were also shocked and alarmed by 9/11, and many of their leaders were convinced that the United States could not allow even remote dangers to grow in an era when terrorists might acquire WMD. Those who favored war believed that toppling Saddam would convince other rogue states that America was simply too powerful to oppose and compel these regimes to conform to U.S. wishes instead. In the period before the war, in short, the United States was simultaneously powerful, confident of its military prowess, and deeply worried about its own security, a dangerous combination. These various elements form the strategic context in which the decision for war was made and help us understand some of the underlying forces that facilitated that choice. But there was another variable in the equation, and the war would almost certainly not have occurred had it been absent. That element was the Israel lobby, and especially a group of neoconservative policymakers and pundits who had been pushing the United States to attack Iraq since well before 9/11. The pro-war faction believed that removing Saddam would improve America's and Israel's strategic position and launch a process of regional transformation that would benefit the United States and Israel alike.
As a quick entry here, I think is as we go on, and I think is if you really take a close look at this network of people, both in the U.S. and Israel, you'll find, I think, very strong case could be made that what these people were particularly aiming for, we make a strong argument we're not in the best case of either the United States or Israel. So, I mean, as you really look at this, what we're identifying is this particular group of, I just want to throw that in there because that language is in there, but really I think at a deep level, the truth of of this really indicates something else. Certainly for the United States, and I think it could be argued even for Israel as well. So.
Yeah. And, there's aspects, I think, that both you and I, Greg, would disagree with the sort of a bit simplistic realist analysis of Mearsheimer and Walt, especially in relationship to the absence of deep politics and deep political analysis and a deeper background of the war on terror. And then, of course, as we've been uncovering in relationship to the back door to the former Soviet Union in relationship to some of these very complicated politics, both in terms of U.S.-Israel, but also in terms of Israel-Palestine. But we will not delve too deeply into those very geopolitical, analytical disagreements with them in order to just sort of get to what they said, and then why what they said has been so largely not talked about and not really digested properly.
Indeed, we'd be here all night if we went through all of our differences. I just want to throw that in there, though. But
no, I appreciate that. Okay, so back to page 230 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, towards the bottom. Israeli officials and former Israeli leaders supported these efforts because they were eager to see the United States topple one of their main regional adversaries and the man who had launched Scud missiles at Israel in 1991. Pressure from Israel and the lobby was not the only factor behind the Bush administration's decision to attack Iraq in March 2003, but it was a critical element. Many Americans believe that this was a quote-unquote war for oil or for corporations like Halliburton, but there is little direct evidence to support this claim and considerable evidence that casts doubt on it. And an aside here, this is why we are also then going to read from Iraq and the Politics of Oil by Gary Vogler, who saw a lot of this go down and didn't even understand this aspect, this deeper political and really some kind of espionage-based aspect to some of these policy decisions until many, many years later. So that will fill in some of the gaps that were there when Mearsheimer and Walt were writing this, maybe almost 10 years before Vogler maybe even began to fully had his realization and then wrote his expose, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective, which gives us hard data about who did what and why at the time when the invasion was going down and who specifically was put in places of power, which is very interesting. And the so much silence around that book. All right. Back to bottom of page 230 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Walt and Mearsheimer. Quote, other observers blame political advisors such as the Republican strategist Karl Rove and suggest that the war was part of a Machiavellian scheme to keep the country on a war footing and thus ensure a lengthy period of Republican control. This view has a certain partisan appeal, but it too lacks supporting evidence and cannot explain why so many prominent Democrats supported going to war. Another interpretation views the war as the first step in a bold effort to transform the Middle East by spreading democracy. This view is correct, but as we will see, this remarkably ambitious scheme was inextricably linked to concerns about Israel's security.
And on that note, it's interesting. I talked about at the top of this, how the Iraq War was very much framed, or at least within the conversations, the idea, the neoconservative push for wars for democracy, which was, there were many American neoconservatives who did push for that. But it is, as you just mentioned, inextricably, it is linked directly to to this aspect of the Israeli push for war. And as we're going to talk about, there is, as outside even these neocons who pushed for Iraq as a war for democracy, they very much, I would say, were not even nearly essential to the actual propaganda push for wars, as these very serious people who I think are very, very seriously at the deepest levels with the most powerful, most influential aspects of what would be called the American Israel Lobby. So.
Thank you. And as we've discussed before, and I'll just mention it in terms of a future text that we will read in this format is the revelations around the intellectual godfather of that alleged policy of the transform the Middle East by spreading democracy, which of course is Natan Sharansky, who wrote the book on it, who Bush said that was his go-to intellectual on the background reasoning for that policy. And Barry Chamish is a now deceased, sort of deep political, very opinionated Israeli. He's definitely an Israeli patriot and a journalist of some sort. And some people would call him a conspiracy theorist. But for example, he's been like the main Israeli writer on the issues surrounding the Rabin assassination, and how it went deeper than just, disgruntled settlers, and that it went into inside of the Israeli, certain aspects of the Israeli security services. But in his book, Bye Bye Gaza, I think it's called. Let me see. Yeah, Bye Bye Gaza by Barry Chamish. He actually has a piece that talks about a civil suit or a book that was written about Natan Sharansky by another Israeli, both of who are, Soviet Jewish refugees, and the assertion by this Israeli surgeon was that Sharansky was known to have been basically a tool of the Soviet police forces, by other Jews who were in the camps. And so there's a lot of more stuff coming out, especially in relationship to Craig Unger's book, American Compromat, about how deep and how aggressive the Soviet intelligence compromise of Jewish refugees into Israel and into the West really was, where it's said to have been 90% of Jewish refugees were basically forced to sign intelligence contracts of some sort, where future, duties in their future countries could be collected by Soviet intelligence. So we even question whether the good faith aspect potentially of both the godfather, the intellectual godfather of that alleged policy of spreading democracy in the Middle East, and even who he says he is potentially. Now, we don't have proof of that, but we are suspicious. So these are some of the considerations that go through our minds when we read texts like this. But back to the text. Page 231, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay, so they talked about, quote, transform the Middle East by spreading democracy. This view is correct, but as we will see, this remarkably ambitious scheme was inextricably linked to concerns about Israel's security. In contrast to these alternative explanations, we argue that the war was motivated, at least in good part, by a desire to make Israel more secure. This was a controversial claim before the war started, but it is even more controversial now that Iraq has turned into a strategic disaster. To be clear, the individuals and groups that pushed for war believed it would benefit both Israel and the United States, and they certainly did not anticipate the debacle that ultimately occurred. Okay, we have to say at that point, that's an assumption. And now we can't prove the negative of that, but, how do they really know? Do they really know all of the intent? And that's why we also want to read aspects of, Clean Break, where it directly talks about what you can understand as destabilization and rollback in relationship to Iraq. That's the language in the Clean Break paper once we get there. And it calls for overthrow in Iraq. But you could imagine that there might have been, some aspects of the American neocons probably were drinking the Kool-Aid, the Sharansky Kool-Aid, and they believed that there was going to be a quick victory, and they would then sort of create a bulkhead for American-style democracy. But it's also very possible that other players of different backgrounds had destabilization fully in mind in relationship to this. And this, as we've talked about before, it's totally known history that the United States was interested in creating a Vietnam for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So it's not impossible to think that there might be other players who might want to create a quagmire for what was then perceived as the American empire in the Middle East. Now, can we prove that? No. But is that off the table? No. It's just, and so the fact that Walt and Mearsheimer basically just sort of like assert that no one could have seen this coming, which sounds very similar to September 11th when there was even drills of something very similar happening. There's something, I just had to point that out. All right. Back to the text, unless you have a comment, Greg.
No, I concur, and I concur with that. And I do think that you can make a case that there were people in positions who knew of some of the consequences and weren't really considering that as one way or the other in terms of their push for war. So anyway, I'll let you continue.
Okay, so 231 page of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. A quote, I will read this again. To be clear, the individuals and groups that push for war believed it would benefit both Israel and the United States, and they certainly did not anticipate the debacle that ultimately occurred. Regardless, a proper account of the lobby's role in encouraging the war is ultimately a question of evidence, and there is considerable evidence that Israel and pro-Israel groups, especially the neoconservatives, played important roles in the decision to invade. Before examining the evidence, however, it is worth noting that a number of knowledgeable and well-respected individuals have said openly that the war was linked with Israel's security. Philip Zelikow, a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, 2001 to 2003, executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and an aside there, when we read Philip Sheenan's book, The Commission, which is some of the backstory of the 9/11 Commission, it shows that someone like Zelikow actually wrote the outline for the 9/11 Commission before they even really began their investigation, let alone put it to the actual commissioners themselves to decide what the outline of their investigation should look like. But back to the text, quote, and Counselor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, 2005 to 2006, told a University of Virginia audience on September 10th, 2002, that Saddam was not a direct threat to the United States. Quote, the real threat, he argued, is, quote, the threat against Israel, unquote. He went on to say, quote, and this is the threat that dare not speak its name because the Europeans don't care deeply about that threat, and the American government doesn't want to lean too hard on it rhetorically because it is not a popular sell, unquote. General Wesley Clark, the retired NATO commander and former presidential candidate, said in August 2002 that, quote, those who favor this attack now will tell you candidly and privately that it is probably true that Saddam Hussein is no threat to the United States, but they are afraid that at some point he might decide, if he had a nuclear weapon, to use it against Israel, unquote. In January 2003, a German journalist asked Ruth Wedgwood, a prominent neoconservative academic and a member of the influential Defense Policy Board, chaired by Richard Pearl, why the journalist should support the war. I could, quote, be impolite, Wedgwood said, and remind Germany of its special relationship with Israel. Saddam presents an existential threat to Israel. That is simply true, unquote. Wedgwood did not justify the war by saying that Iraq posed a direct threat to Germany or the United States. A few weeks before the United States invaded Iraq, the journalist Joe Klein wrote in Time magazine, quote, a stronger Israel is very much embedded in the rationale for war with Iraq. It is a part of the argument that dare not speak its name, a fantasy quietly cherished by the neoconservative faction in the Bush administration and by many leaders of the American Jewish community, unquote. Former Senator Ernest Hollings made a similar argument in May 2004. After noting that Iraq was not a direct threat to the United States, he asked why we invaded that country. Quote, the answer, which he said everyone knows, is because we want to secure our friend Israel, unquote. A number of Jewish groups promptly labeled Hollings an anti-Semite, with the ADL calling his comments, quote, reminiscent of age-old anti-Semitic canards about a Jewish conspiracy to control and manipulate the government, unquote. Hollings adamantly rejected the charge, noting that he had long been a staunch supporter of Israel and that he was simply stating the obvious, not making an untruthful claim. He demanded that his critics, quote, apologize to me for talking about anti-Semitism, unquote. A handful of other public figures, Patrick Buchanan, Arnaud de Bourgegrave, Maureen Dowd, Georgie Ann Geyer, Gary Hart, Chris Matthews, Congressman James P. Moran, Democrat from Virginia, Robert Novak, Tim Russert, and General Anthony Zinni either said or strongly hinted that pro-Israel hardliners in the United States were the principal movers behind the Iraq War. In Novak's case, he referred to the war well before it happened as, quote, Sharon's War, unquote, and continues to do so today.
It's interesting, a name that's not mentioned here because it came out after the Israel lobby, the book was published, was the famous Watergate journalist, Carl Bernstein, on MSNBC's Morning Joe in 2013, basically said that that the war in Iraq wouldn't have happened without influence of Israel and the American Israel lobby. And he also basically said during that segment that he's allowed to say that because he's Jewish. So you could add Carl Bernstein to the influential list of American insiders who made this sentiment, but this was, of course, 2013 after the book was published. So add Carl Bernstein to that list.
And then Joe Scarborough basically told him that, no, I don't think you are actually allowed to do that, even though you're Jewish. I think that was said too. But you're exactly right, Greg. So this is sort of like an unspoken secret, or that everybody knew at some level. So that then goes to the politics of all of this, which is one of the reasons why we, work to talk about this in a way that's grounded in text, grounded in fact, and so we can, have a discussion that doesn't so quickly get polluted by anti-Semitism and or the accusations of anti-Semitism, which especially in terms of these core politics around foreign policy and all that, but also definitely about Israel-Palestine, they're largely weaponized. It doesn't mean there's not sometimes something there too, but it's usually used to stop the conversation. So we want to have a productive and constructive and reasonable conversation. And so we like to ground it in the text. All right, page 232 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay, so it said Novak was, this is quoting Novak. Quote, I am convinced he said in April 2007 that Israel made a large contribution to the decision to embark on this war. I know that on the eve of the war, Sharon said in a closed conversation with senators that if they could succeed in getting rid of Saddam Hussein, it would solve Israel's security problems, unquote. The connection between Israel and the Iraq War was widely recognized long before the fighting started. When the prospect of an American invasion was beginning to dominate the headlines in the fall of 2002, the journalist Michael Kinsley wrote that, quote, the lack of public discussion about the role of Israel is the proverbial elephant in the room. Everybody sees it, no one mentions it, unquote. The reason for this reluctance, he observed, was fear of being labeled an anti-Semite. 2 weeks before the war started, Nathan Gutman reported in Haaretz that, quote, the voices linking Israel to the war are getting louder and louder. It is claimed the desire to help Israel is the major reason for President George Bush sending American soldiers to a superfluous war in the Gulf, and the voices come from all directions, unquote. A few days later, Bill Keller, who is now the executive editor of the New York Times, wrote, quote, "The idea that this war is about Israel is persistent and more widely held than you may think," unquote. Finally, in May 2005, 2 years after the war began, Barry Jacobs of the American Jewish Committee acknowledged that the belief that Israel and the neoconservatives were responsible for getting the United States to invade Iraq was quote-unquote pervasive in the U.S. intelligence community. Some will surely argue that anyone who suggests that concerns about Israel's security had a significant influence on the Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq is either an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. Such charges are both predictable and false. As we will now show, there is abundant evidence that Israel and the lobby played crucial roles in making that war happen. This is not to assert that either Israel or the lobby quote-unquote controls U.S. foreign policy. It is simply to say that they successfully press for a particular set of policies and were able, in a particular context, to achieve their objective. Had the circumstances been different, they would not have been able to get the United States to go to war. But without their efforts, America would probably not be in Iraq today. Okay, next section here. We're on page 233 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Quote, Israel and the Iraq War. Israel has always considered Iraq an enemy, but it became especially concerned about Iraq in the mid-1970s, when France agreed to provide Saddam with a nuclear reactor. For good reason, Israel worried that Iraq might use the reactor as a stepping stone to building nuclear weapons. Responding to the threat, in 1981, the Israelis bombed the Osirak reactor before it became operational. Despite this setback, Iraq continued working on its nuclear program in dispersed and secret locations. This situation helps explain Israel's enthusiastic support for the first Gulf War in 1991. Its main concern was not to push Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, but to topple Saddam, and especially to make sure that Iraq's nuclear program was dismantled. Although the United States did not remove Saddam from power, the UN inspections regime imposed on Baghdad after the war reduced, but did not eliminate Israel's concerns. In fact, Haaretz reported on February 26, 2001, that, quote, Sharon believes that Iraq poses more of a threat to regional stability than Iran, due to the errant, irresponsible behavior of Saddam Hussein's regime, unquote. Sharon's comments notwithstanding, by early 2002, when it was becoming increasingly apparent that the Bush administration was thinking seriously about another war against Iraq, some Israeli leaders told U.S. officials that they thought Iran was a greater threat. They were not opposed to toppling Saddam, however, and Israel's leaders, who are rarely reticent when it comes to giving their American counterparts advice, never tried to convince the Bush administration not to go to war against Iraq. No.
And, well, just real quick, we're not going to get into it here. It's be another conversation for another time, maybe. But you mentioned these people who thought Iran was an even bigger threat than Iraq. And later on in the Bush administration, much of the same crew who pushed hard for war in Iraq, it does appear that there was a major effort to really try to get the U.S. into a military conflict with Iran, but it appears to have been stood down by other elements within the American military intelligence establishment. So I want to throw that in there as well. Like throughout there, Iran, and there was indicators of a very serious push for a military conflict with Iran during the Bush years. So just want to throw that in there as well.
Okay, thank you. All right, top of page 234 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. From the chapter Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. Quote, nor did the Israeli government ever try to mobilize its supporters in the United States to lobby against the invasion. On the contrary, Israeli leaders were worried only that the United States might lose sight of the Iranian threat in its pursuit of Saddam. Once they realized that the Bush administration was countenancing a bolder scheme, one that called for winning quickly in Iraq and then dealing with Iran and Syria, they began to push vigorously for an American invasion. In short, Israel did not initiate the campaign for war against Iraq. As will become clear, it was the neoconservatives in the United States who conceived that idea and were principally responsible for pushing it forward in the wake of September 11. But Israel did join forces with the neoconservatives to help sell the war to the Bush administration and the American people, well before the president had made the final decision to invade. Indeed, Israeli leaders worried constantly in the months before the war that President Bush might decide not to go to war after all, and they did what they could to ensure Bush did not get cold feet. The Israelis began their efforts in the spring of 2002, a few months before the Bush administration launched its own campaign to sell the Iraq War to the American public. Former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to Washington in mid-April and met with U.S. senators and the editors of the Washington Post, among others, to warn them that Saddam was developing nuclear weapons that could be delivered against the American homeland in suitcases or satchels. A few weeks later, Ra'anan Gissen, Sharon's spokesman, told a Cleveland reporter that, quote, if Saddam Hussein is not stopped now, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, we will have to deal with an Iraq that is armed with nuclear weapons, with an Iraq that has delivery systems for weapons of mass destruction, unquote. In mid-May, Shimon Peres, the former Israeli prime minister, now serving as foreign minister, appeared on CNN, where he said that, quote, Saddam Hussein is as dangerous as bin Laden, unquote, and the United States, quote, cannot sit and wait, unquote, while he builds a nuclear arsenal. Instead, Peres insisted it was time to topple the Iraqi leader. A month later, Ehud Barak, another former Israeli prime minister, and by the way, another former head of Israeli military intelligence, Amman, and also, by the way, a close associate of Jeffrey Epstein's high-level compromise operation, which we now know more about and how that actually might have potentially interfaced with some of the more deep political covert operations behind certain aspects of leverage there. But we won't go into all of that background now. And of course, wasn't it also Ehud Barak who recommended Black Cube to Harvey Weinstein? I believe so.
Yes, indeed.
So there are these intersections here in terms of the politics. All right, so back to the bottom of page 234 of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay, quote, a month later, Ehud Barak, another former Israeli prime minister, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recommending that the Bush administration, quote, should, first of all, focus on Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. Once he is gone, there will be a different Arab world, unquote. On August 12, 2002, Sharon told the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset that Iraq, quote, is the greatest danger facing Israel, unquote. Then on August 16th, 10 days before Vice President Cheney kicked off the campaign for war with a speech to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, several newspapers and television and radio networks, including Haaretz, The Washington Post, CNN, and CBS News, reported that Israel was urging the United States not to delay an attack on Iraq. Sharon told the Bush administration that postponing the operation, quote, will not create a more convenient environment for action in the future, unquote. Putting off an attack, Ra'anan Gissen said, would, quote, only give him, Saddam, more of an opportunity to accelerate his program of weapons of mass destruction, unquote. Foreign Minister Peres told CNN that, quote, the problem today is not if, but when, unquote. Postponing an attack would be a grave mistake, he said, because Saddam would be better armed down the road. Deputy Defense Minister Weissman Shiri offered a similar view, warning, quote, if the Americans do not do this now, it will be harder to do it in the future. In a year or two, Saddam Hussein will be further along in developing weapons of mass destruction, unquote. Perhaps CBS best captured what was going on in the headline for its story. Quote, Israel to U.S., don't delay Iraq attack, unquote. Perez and Sharon both made sure to emphasize that they, quote, did not want to be seen as urging the United States to act, and that America should act according to its own judgment, unquote. And we should just point out here, too, that, again, back to the Epstein network, one of the key factual pieces that might suggest that it hooks up to some of the more covert leverage aspects of the war on Iraq is that Epstein's major benefactor and partner in many different ways, Leslie Wexner, was part of a group and the head of a group that solicited and contracted the work of the sort of guru of Republican pollsters, Frank Luntz, to put together the Iraq War study that was actually framed as about how to talk about the Iraq War in a way that put it in the American mind as in American interests and not about Israeli interests. So that is a very interesting connection there. And of course, Wexner is the one who basically gifted the most expensive, brownstone in Manhattan, apparently, directly to Epstein with all of the, video wiring that was obviously involved in the, blackmail part of the sexual abuse and trafficking operation. So these are some of the intersections in relationship to deep politics to begin to sort of understand some of these things that seem separated, but can be understood as part of a network of leverage of some sort. Okay, back to page 235 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay, quote, Perez and Sharon both made sure to emphasize that they, quote, did not want to be seen as urging the United States to act, and that America should act according to its own judgment, unquote. Israeli leaders and many of their supporters in the United States were well aware that some American commentators, most notably Patrick Buchanan, had argued that the driving force behind the 1991 Gulf War was, quote, the Israeli Defense Ministry and its Amen corner in the United States, unquote. And we'll put aside the sort of questionable, deeply questionable aspects of who Patrick Buchanan is actually serving in a not potentially good faith manner off for another time, I think. But okay, interesting. Okay, so back to the text. Quote, denying any responsibility made good political sense, but there is no question, based on their own public comments, that by August 2002, Israel's leaders saw Saddam as a threat to the Jewish state and were encouraging the Bush administration to launch a war to remove him from power. News stories around the same time also reported that, quote, Israeli intelligence officials have gathered evidence that Iraq is speeding up efforts to produce biological and chemical weapons, unquote. Perez told CNN that, quote, we think and know that he, Saddam, is on his way to acquiring a nuclear option, unquote. Haaretz reported that Saddam had given an order to Iraq's Atomic Energy Commission last week to speed up its work, unquote. Israel was feeding these alarming reports about Iraq's WMD programs to Washington at a time when, by Sharon's own reckoning, quote, strategic coordination between Israel and the U.S. has reached unprecedented dimensions, unquote. Following the invasion and the revelation that there were no WMD in Iraq, the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Israeli Knesset released separate reports revealing that much of the intelligence Israel gave to the Bush administration was false. As one retired Israeli general put it, quote, Israeli intelligence was a full partner to the picture presented by American and British intelligence regarding Iraq's non-conventional capabilities, unquote. Of course, Israel is hardly the first state to push another country to take a costly or risky action on its behalf. States facing external dangers often try to pass the buck to others, and the United States has a rich tradition of similar behavior itself. It backed Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, in order to help contain the threat from revolutionary Iran. And it armed and backed the Afghan Mujahideen following the Soviet invasion of that country in 1979. The United States did not send its own troops to fight these wars. It merely did what it could to help others who had their own reasons for fighting do the heavy lifting. Given their understandable desire to have the United States eliminate a regional rival, it is not surprising that Israeli leaders were distressed when President Bush decided to seek UN Security Council authorization for war in September 2002, and even more worried when Saddam agreed to let UN inspectors back into Iraq. And aside here, Greg, I believe this will probably end up hooking into the UK GCHQ Iraq War whistleblower Catherine Gunn, which was actually sort of exposed a memo, an email memo that I believe referred to UN action in relationship to the UK. I'm not sure about that, but I believe that was the case of her whistleblowing.
Yes, I believe that I think that is correct, and of course that ties into the documentary film about Catherine Gunn from.
It's not a document. It's actually like a drama film. Actually.
Yeah, a film about Catherine Gunn from the summer of 2019, and the movie was. The movie was titled Official Secrets, which deals with that case. But yes, this is very much interconnected as it relates to. Yeah, I mean, this was at the center of the efforts to ensure the United Kingdom entered into the war, and but yeah, it is interconnected. All this at a higher level.
Okay, so back to page 236 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, middle of the page. Okay, they were distressed when Bush decided to seek UN security authorization for war in September 2002, and even more worried when Saddam agreed to let UN inspectors back into Iraq. These developments troubled Israel's leaders because they seemed to reduce the likelihood of war. Foreign Minister Peres told reporters, quote, "The campaign against Saddam Hussein is a must. Inspections and inspectors are good for decent people, but dishonest people can overcome easily inspections and inspectors," unquote. On a visit to Moscow in late September, Sharon made it clear to Russian President Vladimir Putin, who was leading the charge for new inspections, that it was too late for them to be effective. Peres became so frustrated with the UN process in the following months that in mid-February 2003, he lashed out at France by questioning its status as a permanent member of the Security Council. Okay, I just want to fill in some of the historical irony of that, too, is that Shimon Peres, the nuclear facility at Dimona in Israel, which, by the way, is just recently there's been an AP report about new construction at Dimona. But the background there, it's named after Peres because he is recognized as the godfather of the Israeli nuclear program, and he worked directly with France back in the day in order to begin what was started as a covert, and to this day it's still non-admitted. And basically Israel is just one of maybe 4 countries that is a non-signatory to the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Treaty. And it was Peres who helped facilitate those early days of nuclear materials transfer, nuclear scientific knowledge transfer in relationship to what was called, I believe, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, LACOM, or LECM, which then Peres then tasked or recruited eventual Hollywood producer of the film by Oliver Stone, JFK, Arnon Milchan, to become an agent of LACOM under Peres originally. And it was also Peres who created the covert military relationship with apartheid South Africa, I believe in the early 60s, that was part of the development and testing of nuclear weapons. So it's interesting to then have Peres in the immediate anticipation of the Iraq War go attack the French publicly. So there's a lot of history there, I think, to unpack, but that'll be it for now. Okay. to page 236 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Okay, quote, Peres became so frustrated with the UN process in the following months that in mid-February 2003, he lashed out at France by questioning its status as a permanent member of the Security Council. Israel's adamant opposition to inspections put it in a lonely and awkward position, as Mark Perelman made clear in an article in the Forward in mid-September 2002. Quote, Saddam Hussein's surprise acceptance of unconditional United Nations weapons inspections put Israel on the hot seat this week, forcing it into the open as the only nation actively supporting the Bush administration's goal of Iraqi regime change, unquote. Pressing ahead in the face of UN diplomacy, Israelis portrayed Saddam in the direst terms, often comparing him to Adolf Hitler. If the West did not stand up to Iraq, they claimed, it would be making the same mistake it made with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Shlomo Avneri, a prominent Israeli scholar, wrote in the Los Angeles Times that, quote, all who condemn the 1930s appeasement of Germany should reflect long and hard on whether a failure to act today against Iraq will one day be viewed the same way, unquote. I just want to point out, too, that I almost feel like it's the opposite at some level, because if you go look at the studies of Jewish Australian scientist Gideon Polaya, who's looked at the over-death statistics, most especially in Muslim nations, predominantly Muslim nations, we're talking in the post 9/11 era. We're talking probably, he says it looks like 5 million direct deaths from the wars, and up to dozens of millions of indirect deaths in relationship to these wars. So I think looking historically accurately back at these comments, I think it's actually almost exactly the opposite in terms of the way that it all has gone down. All right, back to the text. Page 237, the Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. 237. Okay. The implication was, quote, the implication was unmistakable. Anyone who opposed invading Iraq, or as we have seen, pushed Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians, was an appeaser, just like Neville Chamberlain, and bound to be regarded as such by future generations. The Jerusalem Post was especially hawkish, frequently running editorials and op-eds favoring the war and rarely running pieces arguing against it. Indeed, it went so far as to editorialize that, quote, ousting Saddam is the linchpin of the war on terrorism, without which it is impossible to begin in earnest, let alone win, unquote. Other Israeli public figures echoed Peres and Sharon's advocacy for war instead of diplomatic wrangling. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak wrote a New York Times op-ed in early September 2002, claiming that, quote, Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapons program provides the urgent need for his removal, unquote. He went on to warn that, quote, the greatest risk now lies in inaction, unquote. His predecessor, Benjamin Netanyahu, published a similar piece a few weeks later in the Wall Street Journal titled, quote, The Case for Toppling Saddam, unquote. Netanyahu declared, quote, today nothing less than dismantling his regime will do, unquote, adding that, quote, I believe I speak for the overwhelming majority of Israelis in supporting a preemptive strike against Saddam's regime, unquote, which he claimed was, quote, feverishly trying to acquire nuclear weapons, unquote.
In this September 2002, we mentioned that the Wall Street Journal op-ed by Benjamin Netanyahu. It was September 12th, 2002, when Netanyahu spoke to the House Congress, particularly the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And interestingly enough, when John Kerry was Secretary of State in 2015, around the controversy surrounding the P5+1 agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, Kerry reiterated and brought back up to in the public eye that Netanyahu had advised the U.S. to invade Iraq during that congressional testimony. So this is all right in that time period of like the real escalation of things. And so Netanyahu writing in the Wall Street Journal, going in front of Congress, you're seeing a trend here.
It's a good point. And was that Rupert Murdoch's
yes,
platform?
the Wall Street Journal is a Murdoch publication. Yes.
Okay.
It's News Corp, the same company that owns Fox News.
All right. Well, thank you for picking up the time scheme here, Greg. All right. Middle of page 237 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, Netanyahu's influence, of course, extended well beyond writing op-eds and appearing on television. Having gone to high school, college, and graduate school in the United States, he speaks fluent English and is not only familiar with how the American political system works, but operates skillfully in it. And by the way, there's some very interesting footage of then Benjamin Netai, or Ben Netai, as he called himself, debating, I think it was probably while he was at MIT, about the Israel-Palestine issue. That's a very interesting video to look at. And then the other thing, of course, is that Netanyahu went through Bain and Company, and along, I think it's probably about a similar time in relationship to Orit Gadesh, who is, I believe now still is a CEO or something like that, high level there at Bain and Company, which is out of Boston. All right. Back to the text. Quote, he speaks fluent English. That says Netanyahu. He speaks fluent English and is not only familiar with how the American political system works, but operates skillfully in it. He has close ties with neoconservatives inside and outside of the Bush administration, and he has extensive contacts on Capitol Hill, where he has either spoken or testified on numerous occasions. Barak is also well connected with American policymakers, politicians, security experts, and pundits. The Israeli government, I mean, one thing, and think about the timing of this writing too. This is right as Jeffrey Epstein first gets arrested, I believe. Right? I think it's at the same time here. So that's what's not, known and being spoken of is this Ehud Barak of Jeffrey Epstein relationship, which is unfolding at that time. So that's just,
very true.
Some interesting parallel there. All right. Back to the text, page 237 of the Israel Lobby by Walt and Mearsheimer. Quote, the Israeli government's war fervor did not diminish in the months before the fighting started. Haaretz, for example, ran a story on February 17th, 2003, titled Enthusiastic IDF Awaits War in Iraq, unquote. Wait, I think I had the time scheme wrong on this because I was thinking of 2007 when Epstein was arrested, I think. So this was earlier.
Still had the aforementioned, we talked about influence of Epstein and Wexner over the September 2002 American senators in UK as far as the propaganda push for Iraq. So,
and what's interesting about that's Johnny Vedmore is a UK activist journalist who wrote an article where he actually went into the Epstein flight logs and found that Epstein almost always traveled with more than one other person. And one of the very few flights where he was just flying with one other person was one where I think it was N. Junkerman, which was Nicole Junkerman, who is a very interesting figure that you can go look at. But she then pops up again in relationship to apparent Israeli military intelligence cyber operations that intersect with Epstein later on, which would include something like the company Carbon 9/11, which is being at this moment proposed to different municipalities in the United States as a replacement for our 911 system. And then Nicole Junkerman, who was on this flight during that fall of 2002 with Epstein to the UK, has also been at the epicenter of certain of the data privatization in relationship to the UK health administration. So there's so then we've done a few different shows on this where we talk about the geography and the temporality of all of that in terms of at the same time as when they are in the foothills outside of UK GCHQ, the British NSA, when this, there's developing whistleblower there in terms of Catherine Gunn, and then U.S. senators are apparently part of this, and this is all right before crucial votes that end up leading to the Iraq War. And so these are sort of the covert history of Iraq War leverage that have to be sort of pieced together rather than directly read from text. So that's one of the things that we work to do with our deep core texts is we work to thread these texts into other bits of information. Some of them are actually not just text, but also videos or, other kinds of source documents like audio. All right, back to the text, and I'll try to stop going on so many tangents here. I apologize. All right. The bottom of page 237 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the Israeli government's war fervor did not diminish in the months before the fighting started. Haaretz, for example, ran a story on February 17th, 2003 titled, quote, enthusiastic IDF awaits war in Iraq, unquote, which said that Israel's, quote, military and political leadership yearns for war in Iraq, unquote. 10 days later, James Bennett wrote a story in the New York Times with the headline, quote, Israel says war on Iraq would benefit the region, unquote. The Forward published a piece on March 7, 2003, titled, quote, Jerusalem frets as U.S. battles Iraq war delays, unquote, which made it clear that Israel's leaders were hoping for war sooner rather than later. Given all this activity, it is unsurprising that Bill Clinton recounted in 2006 that, quote, every Israeli politician I knew, unquote, believed that Saddam Hussein was so great a threat that he should be removed even if he did not have WMD. And aside here, quick, is just, of course, and there's the long-term Bill Clinton relationship with Jeffrey Epstein that was ongoing while he was president, even to where a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell has testified that that then President Bill Clinton showed up for a party at Epstein's Les Wexner gifted brownstone in Manhattan while he was president, while all of the criminal quote unquote shenanigans that Epstein was a part of were also apparently going on.
Yeah. And, going back, we mentioned at the beginning in the, when we first started reading from this text here from the, Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, we mentioned that, it was mentioned that, simply that all of these factors that could explain the Democratic support for the war in Iraq, because remember, it wasn't just these Republicans. I mean, remember during the Democratic primary, Joe Biden was confronted about his support for the Iraq war. And speaking of less than perhaps noble noble desires in terms of pushing that, Tulsi Gabbard did that. And that's another conversation for another time. But Biden's support for the Iraq war was brought up. Hillary Clinton, of course, supported the Iraq war, et cetera. And once again, like when you see like the explanations for why they go along with this, considering like they're not in it for oil interests or for whatnot. I mean, you have to go back obviously to this factor of the domestic Israel lobby. And so, I mean, that to me, it seems like when you bring up these the Democratic support for the Iraq war, I mean, that's ultimately is the direction that you'd have to go with this because of the influence of domestic Israel lobby, particularly say AIPAC over so many of our Democratic politicians, in addition to Republican politicians. I mean, this is that and also something deeper like an Epstein factor maybe with the Clinton. But I mean, in terms of general Democratic politicians, you have to look at the Israel lobby in fear perhaps of crossing this lobby, this very influential lobby, and powerful people within it that are very much supportive of this push for war that they see on behalf of the objectives of what they see as beneficial for Israel and for its geopolitics. So.
And Jeffrey Epstein alleged to have helped start the Clinton Foundation, supported the including funding of it apparently, and I haven't yet seen a decisive factual dismissal of that allegation.
And real quick, and just to throw in one more real quick aside here, it's interrelated to this. Candidate Donald Trump used both the Bush family launching the Iraq War against Jeb Bush as well as Jeffrey Epstein against the Clintons, more or less like a propaganda network around Donald Trump, when in reality, Trump was very much in bed with the Epstein operation, in addition to also not being a principled opponent of the Iraq War in any way, shape, or form. In fact, Trump's quote-unquote opposition to the Iraq War was limited to simply putting, if I'd said good, we would have taken the oil. So, exactly. I mean, it's just throwing that out there because, I mean, it is relevant in terms of this faction of the neocons, that these hawks that were very supportive of Donald Trump. So I just want to throw that in there.
Okay, very good. All right, we're at the bottom of page 237 of The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Quote, all right, given all this activity, it is unsurprising that Bill Clinton recounted in 2006 that, quote, every Israeli politician I knew, unquote, believed that Saddam Hussein was so great a threat that he should be removed even if he did not have WMD. Nor was the desire for war confined to Israel's leaders. Apart from Kuwait, which Saddam conquered in 1990, Israel was the only country outside of the United States where a majority of politicians and the public enthusiastically favored war. A poll taken in early 2002 found that 58% of Israeli Jews believe that, quote, Israel should encourage the United States to attack Iraq, unquote. Another poll taken a year later in February 2003 found that 77.5% of Israeli Jews wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Even in Tony Blair's Britain, a poll taken just before the war revealed that 51% of the respondents opposed it, while only 39% supported it. This rather unusual situation prompted Gideon Levy of Haaretz to ask, quote, why is it that in England 50,000 people have demonstrated against the war in Iraq, whereas in Israel no one has? Why is it that in Israel there is no public debate about whether the war is necessary, unquote? He went on to say, quote, Israel is the only country in the West whose leaders support the war unreservedly and where no alternative opinion is voiced, unquote. Israel's enthusiasm for war eventually led some of its allies in America to tell Israeli officials to damp down their hawkish rhetoric, lest the war look like it was being fought for Israel. In the fall of 2002, for example, a group of American political consultants known as the Israel Project circulated a 6-page memorandum to key Israelis and pro-Israel leaders in the United States. The memo was titled, quote, Talking About Iraq, unquote, and was intended as a guide for public statements about the war. Quote, if your goal is regime change, you must be much more careful with your language because of the potential backlash. You do not want Americans to believe that the war on Iraq is being waged to protect Israel rather than to protect America, unquote. Reflecting that same concern on the eve of the war, Sharon, according to several reports, told Israeli diplomats and politicians to keep quiet about a possible war in Iraq, and certainly not to say anything that made it appear that Israel was pushing the Bush administration to topple Saddam. The Israeli leader was worried by the growing perception that Israel was advocating a U.S. invasion of Iraq. In fact, Israel was. It just did not want its position to be widely known. The next section, bottom of page 238 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt, in the chapter 8, titled Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. This section titled The Lobby in the Iraq War. Quote, the driving force behind the Iraq War was a small band of neoconservatives who had long favored the energetic use of American power to reshape critical areas of the world. They had advocated toppling Saddam since the mid-1990s and believed this step would benefit the United States and Israel alike. This group included prominent officials in the Bush administration such as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, the number 2 and 3 civilians in the Pentagon. Richard Pearl, Kenneth Edelman, and James Woolsey, members of the influential Defense Policy Board, Scooter Libby, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, John Bolton, Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, and his Special Assistant David Wormser, and Elliot Abrams, who is in charge of Middle East policy at the National Security Council. It also included a handful of well-known journalists like Robert Kagan, Charles Krauthammer, William Crystal, and William Safire. The appointment of a number of neoconservatives to top policy positions was seen by Israelis and their American allies as a very positive development. When Wolfowitz was selected to be Deputy Defense Secretary in January 2001, the Jerusalem Post reported that, quote, the Jewish and pro-Israel communities are jumping with joy, unquote. In the spring of 2002, the Forward pointed out that Wolfowitz is, quote, known as the most hawkishly pro-Israel voice in the administration, unquote. And it selected him later in 2002 as the first among 50 notables who, quote, have consciously pursued Jewish activism, unquote.
I'll throw in here, we're not going to read from this article here today, but this is a great supplemental article to go along with this context. And we've referenced this article before on the Antidote, but I'm going to go back to it again, refer to it again, from August 15, 2002 in The Nation, nation.com. The men from JINSA and CSP, they want not just a U.S. invasion of Iraq, but, quote, total war, end quote, against Arab regimes. And so that gets into the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, now known as Jewish Institute for National Security of America, as well as CSP, the Center for Security Policy, which is the think tank of Frank Gaffney, who's very, very close with this entire clique of neoconservative, whether it be John Bolton or whether it be Richard Pearl. And of course, that goes back to some of the original neocon hawks that were former Democrats that went, that moved on to the Republican Party, became known as neoconservatives. And what I find interesting about this is that even in this article, it even breaks down like even where here in the book, Paul Wolfowitz is like mentioned as like the most hawkish on Israel. And it's interesting because Paul Wolfowitz is regularly referred to as like one of the neocon architects of the Iraq War. But even in the context of this Nation magazine article, it's pointed out how Paul Wolfowitz wasn't as hawkish as some of these figures, such as Frank Gaffney, for example, or those around Gaffney, John Bolton, etc. So I find that interesting that Wolfowitz is another one of the people who's referred to regularly in terms of like within anti-war circles, within aspects of Israeli Zionist criticism circles, as being one of the architects of the war. And so this article really gets into these to many of the names you just mentioned as well, but even points out that even Paul Wolfowitz wasn't even among the most really, like, there were people far more hawkish, maybe within the administration itself, but even outside the administration, with direct influence and input on the administration, there were people who went even way more hawkish on a combination of matters as it relates to Israel than even policies such as Israeli settlements, which are all directly interconnected into the larger scope of this Israel lobby and the networks that pushed for the Iraq War. And even then, like Wolfowitz, hawkishness pales in comparison to some of these other people. So the men from JINSA and CSP from The Nation, August 15, 2002, is a great supplement to understand the mindset of these many of these Iraq War architects. So
thank you for that, Greg. And I think there was a Mother Jones article that's a good coupling with that.
All right,
the lie factor.
I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. I think there's another. Thank you, Greg. There's another article that I think was published in Mother Jones that's a good coupling with that article that you mentioned that I think is titled The Lie Factory, which actually goes into the facts of the construction of the intelligence fraud aspect of the Iraq War that ties into the Office of Special Plans. And
yes. It's actually Jason Vest who wrote the Nation piece. The men from Jensen CSP co-wrote this piece along with Robert Dreyfus, and this article was published in Mother Jones. It looks like the January 2004 edition of Mother Jones magazine, or February 2004 edition of Mother Jones magazine. Mother Jones Special Investigation, the inside story of how the Bush administration pushed disinformation and bogus intelligence and led the nation to war.
Thank you for that reference, Greg. Okay, back to the text, page 239 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt in the chapter Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East, the Lobby and the Iraq War. Quote, at about the same time, JINSA gave him, I think, right, referencing Wolfowitz, JINSA gave him its Henry M. Jackson Distinguished Service Award for promoting a strong partnership between Israel and the United States. And the Jerusalem Post describing Wolfowitz as, quote, devoutly pro-Israel, unquote, named him its, quote, man of the year, unquote, in 2003. Feith's role in shaping the case for war should also be understood in context of his long-standing commitment to Israel and his prior association with hardline groups there. Feith has close ties with key organizations in the lobby, like the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs and the Zionist Organization of America. He wrote articles in the 1990s supporting the settlements and arguing that Israel should retain the occupied territories. More important, as we noted in Chapter 4, Feith was a co-author, along with Pearl and Wormser, of the famous quote-unquote clean break report in June 1996. Written under the auspices of a right-wing Israeli think tank for incoming Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the report recommended, among other things, that Netanyahu, quote, focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, unquote. It also called for Israel to take steps to reorder the entire Middle East. Netanyahu did not implement their advice, but Feith, Pearl, and Wormser were soon advocating that the Bush administration pursue those same goals. This situation prompted the Haaretz columnist Akiva Eldar to warn that Feith and Pearl, quote, are walking a fine line between their loyalty to American governments and Israeli interests, unquote. As George Packer notes in The Assassin's Gate, quote, for Feith and Wormser, the security of Israel was probably the prime mover, unquote, behind their support for the war. John Bolton and Scooter Libby were staunch supporters of Israel as well. As America's ambassador to the UN, Bolton consistently and enthusiastically defended Israel's interests. So much so, in fact, that in May 2006, the Israeli ambassador to the UN jokingly described Bolton as, quote, a secret member of Israel's own team at the United Nations, unquote. He went on to say that, quote, the secret is out. We really are not just 5 diplomats. We are at least 6, including John Bolton. When, unquote. When Bolton's controversial reappointment to that position became an issue later in 2006, pro-Israel groups weighed in on Bolton's side. Regarding Libby, the Forward reported when he left the White House in the fall of 2005 that Israeli officials liked Libby. They described him as an important contact who was accessible, genuinely interested in Israel-related issues, and very sympathetic to their cause, unquote. Neoconservatives outside the Bush administration are every bit as devoted to Israel as are their compatriots in the government. Consider the comments that the columnist Charles Krauthammer made in Jerusalem on June 10, 2002, after receiving the Guardian of Zion Award from Bar-Ilan University. The theme of his talk was characterizing Israel's participation in the Oslo peace process as an example of misguided Jewish messianism. In In his remarks, Krauthammer explicitly identified himself with Israel, indeed as Israeli. At one point, he observed that, quote, 35 years ago today, the Six-Day War ended. It seemed like a new era. Jerusalem had been reunited. The Temple Mount was ours, Israel, unquote. He went on to say, quote, my thesis tonight is that many of our troubles today as a people and as a Jewish state are rooted precisely in this new messianic enthusiasm, unquote. Krauthammer, like virtually all other neoconservative pundits, was a relentless advocate for war right up until the invasion. Although many of the prominent neoconservatives were Jewish Americans with strong attachments to Israel, some of the leading members of the pro-war party were not. In addition to John Bolton, the signatories of the open letters to Presidents Bush and Clinton, sponsored by the Project for the New American Century, included Gentiles such as former CIA Director James Woolsey and former Secretary of Education William Bennett. Woolsey was particularly obsessed with proving that Saddam was responsible for 9/11, and he devoted considerable effort trying to confirm an early report that Mohammed Atta, one of the 9/11 hijackers, had met with an Iraqi intelligence agent in Prague. The story was implausible and is widely believed to be false, but Woolsey and Vice President Dick Cheney both invoked it to bolster the case for war. I mean, Greg, the aside here that's so obvious too is like Woolsey, dude. Now that he's also out front with the, the JFK conspiracy was that the Soviet Union was in control of Oswald, the lone shooter, in doing it. So it's interesting that someone like that could be such an ardent, false conspiracy theorist over the years, and not sort of rooted out publicly as such. I mean, there's, bits, murmurings of that now with his sort of recent book about Oswald and all of that, but still, I mean, it's so obviously ridiculous.
The fact that he's able to get away with spouting these fantasies. And also in there, I believe that Woolsey, in his capacity as CIA director, tried to move in the direction of indicating that Iraq and Saddam Hussein were behind Oklahoma City as well. So the whole history.
Oh my gosh, really?
Myths. I mean, it was, I believe so. I could go back and check again, but I believe something along those lines. But definitely Iraq and anthrax, Saddam Hussein in September 11th, Oswald and Soviet Union ordering Oswald to kill Kennedy. I mean, there's certainly a major pattern developing here, and it's, and you can see where these, this is the heart of these operations that are designed to, in the case of, obviously to push war against designated enemies of this nest of neocons, as well as in the case of the continuing the historical narrative of like evil communism in terms of the Soviet Union, as we'll get into at some point in the future when we revisit the Kennedy assassination dynamic and the events around that. I think that history begins to indicate that something very different was actually going on between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. But that's not a topic for now. But I mean, just throwing that seed out there that we'll cover that in the future. But as it relates to the absurdity of Woolsey now coming out, along with the, I believe, the now deceased Romanian
Pacepa
defector. Yeah, Pacepa, is that his name?
Or Pacepa or something.
Pacepa, yeah. Ilan Pacepa, I want to say his name is. But now coming out, close to 60 years after the fact, saying that it's that the Soviets ordered Lee Harvey Oswald to kill Kennedy. Keeping two things in mind. Number one, it was just simply a lone assassin, and number two, that it was the communists that did it. So,
and of course, and we'll go into this more later, that the man who was handling what would have been the Oswald file would have been the American chief of counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton, who was also the guy who was constantly apparently disrupting and destroying American counterintelligence on his seeking to undo the monster plot, while also being the chief of desk of the Israel file for American intelligence, while all of the rest of the countries in the region were under the Middle East desk. And yet he, as the head of counterintelligence, kept that all to himself. So that is the package of the complication of what someone like Woolsey is attempting to basically put a turd in a punch bowl about. I mean, that's sort of wild. All these are all discredited, quote unquote conspiracy theories that he puts out there. All right. But they're very serious. They're not like sort of, quote unquote conspiracy theories about who did 9/11 and why from like the grassroots that maybe muddies the water. No, he's obviously engaged in some kind of information warfare, especially obviously in relationship to the run up to the Iraq War, of the kind of information warfare that gets, millions of people's lives destroyed.
And also in the context of what we call the quote unquote alternative media, even the types and these narratives go very prevalent and run wild throughout so much of like the, MAGA media, for example. And of course, ranging all the way from your typical suspects of like, Fox, et cetera, all the way even to somebody like an Alex Jones who once stood against these things, but now sounds like a carbon copy, or at least in the Trump era, sound like a carbon copy of these Woolsey types, blaming everything on the Islamists and the enemy. So anyway, it's very interesting. This pipeline just continues on, and so it's funny. You go full, not funny, but you know what I mean. It's you go full circle, and it really says a lot about the state of where these pipelines of information come from, and all of these people that we're naming are still to this day, like a lot of them are still behind the scenes, like a David Worms, but they're still out there and still. Or at least people, if not directly connected, them indirectly connected, or continuing on in terms of pushing talking points to this day that are still aiming to achieve further goals in the aftermath of the Iraq War. So,
okay, all right, Greg, we still have 20 pages of this chapter. So should we just go for another few pages, and then let's finish this whole section. And the next section, the selling the war to a skeptical America, and then maybe we should come back to this, unless you want to keep going. You tell me after we get through.
Okay, yeah, we can. Yeah, we'll go through this, and then we'll see if we want to move on to. But yeah, let's finish this section here.
Okay, we are on top of page 241 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, the neoconservatives were not the only part of the lobby pushing for war with Iraq. Key leaders of the major pro-Israel organizations lent their voices to the campaign for war. Of course, many of the neoconservatives themselves had close ties to these organizations. In mid-September 2002, when the selling of the war was just getting underway, Michelle Goldberg wrote in Salon that, quote, mainstream Jewish groups and leaders are now among the strongest supporters of an American invasion of Baghdad, unquote. This same point was made in a forward editorial written well after the fall of Baghdad. Quote, as President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Some groups went even further, arguing that the removal of the Iraqi leader would represent a significant step toward bringing peace to the Middle East and winning America's war on terrorism, unquote. The editorial goes on to say that, quote, concern for Israel's safety rightfully factored into the deliberations of the main Jewish groups, unquote. Although there was hardly an opposition to the war among the major Jewish organizations, there was disagreement about how vocal they should be in backing it. The main concern was the fear that too open support for an invasion would make it look like the war was being fought for Israel's sake. Nonetheless, the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations voted to support the use of force against Iraq, quote, as a last resort, unquote, in the fall of 2002. And some prominent figures in the lobby went further. Among the most outspoken proponents of the invasion was Mortimer Zuckerman, the chairman of the Conference of Presidents, who made frequent public statements promoting that war. promoting the war. In late August 2002, he wrote in U.S. News and World Report, where he is editor-in-chief, quote, "Those who predict dire results, if we try to unseat Saddam, simply refuse to understand, as President Bush manifestly does, that if we opt to live with a nightmare, it will only get worse, much worse. The best medicine here, in other words, is preventative medicine," unquote. Jack Rosen, the president of the American Jewish Congress, and Rabbi David Saperstein, the head of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, were also enthusiastic war hawks. By the way, personal parenthetical here, David Saperstein is the brother of one of my dad's childhood friends, actually. So it's just interesting to see the Reform Judaism religious leaders also totally involved here. Okay, back to the text. Page 241 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, Saperstein, who is known for his liberal political views and whom the Washington Post called, quote, the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill, unquote, said in September 2002 that, quote, the Jewish community would want to see a forceful resolution to the threat that Saddam Hussein poses, unquote. And I believe also that David Saperstein became the first Jewish international religious ambassador under Obama after all of this, I think. Okay, quote, Jewish Week, an influential newspaper in the greater New York area, backed the war as well. Gary Rosenblatt, its editor and publisher, wrote an editorial in mid-December 2002 in which he emphasized that, quote, Washington's imminent war on Saddam Hussein is not only an opportunity to rid the war of a dangerous tyrant who presents a particularly horrific threat to Israel, unquote. He went on to say that, quote, when a despot announces his evil intentions, believe him. That's one of the lessons we should have learned from Hitler and the Holocaust. What's more, the Torah instructs that when your enemy seeks to kill you, kill him first. Self-defense is not permitted, it is commanded, unquote. Organizations like AIPAC and the ADL also supported the war, but they did so with minimum fanfare. Now that the war has turned into a disaster, supporters of Israel sometimes argue that AIPAC, which is the most visible group in the lobby, did not back the invasion. But this claim fails the common sense test, as AIPAC usually supports what Israel wants, and Israel certainly wanted the United States to invade Iraq. Nathan Gutman made this very connection in his reporting on AIPAC's annual conference in the spring of 2003, shortly after the war started. Quote, AIPAC is wont to support whatever is good for Israel, and so long as Israel supports the war, so too do the thousands of AIPAC lobbyists who convened in the American capital, unquote. AIPAC Executive Director Howard Kor's statement to the New York Sun in January 2003 is even more revealing, as he acknowledged that, quote, quietly lobbying Congress to approve the use of force in Iraq, unquote, was one of, quote, AIPAC's successes over the past year, unquote. And in a lengthy New Yorker profile of Stephen J. Rosen, who was AIPAC's policy director during the run-up to the Iraq War, Jeffrey Goldberg reported that, quote, AIPAC lobbied Congress in favor of the Iraq War, unquote. I think Stephen Rosen was part of the spy scandal at AIPAC. I'm not sure about that, but I think so. And then, of course, we know Jeffrey Goldberg.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, he was. He was related to Lawrence Franklin. Yes.
And then Goldberg is now the chief editor of The Atlantic, right? I think.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is the former Israeli prison guard.
With time in Israeli prisons.
Yes.
And as I've said parenthetically, he's policing American minds on Israel-Palestine, apparently, or the much larger aspects too.
interesting that, people, some of his I guess some of the people who it's interesting you say policing American minds when there is a serious liberal African American influence at the Atlantic through somebody like a Ta-Nehisi Coates. So all that's interesting. That should all be hashed out. I'm sure, there have been conversations about this, but it'd probably be even hashed out, maybe even more in the public eye. That type of intersectionality, especially when you consider the American police and training in Israel and all that stuff.
Well, and I also go back now to think about the public intellectual disputes between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Dr. Cornel West, and knowing what we know now about what Cornel West apparently not getting tenure at Harvard and having basically in his last encounter with Harvard via the figure of Larry Summers, calling Larry Summers the Ariel Sharon of American higher education. So then I wonder whether there's some background dynamic between, Ta-Nehisi Coates' relationship with Jeffrey Goldberg, and then Dr. Cornel West's much more quote unquote uppity relationship that he had with people like Larry Summers, the Ariel Sharon of higher education.
Very interesting indeed. So let's, I guess we should probably go back to the text, but definitely a very interesting story there.
All right. Page 242 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, AIPAC has remained a firm supporter of the U.S. presence in Iraq. In the fall of 2003, when the Bush administration was having difficulty convincing Senate Democrats to allocate more money for the war, Senate Republicans asked AIPAC to lobby their Democratic colleagues to support the funding request. AIPAC representatives talked to some Democratic senators, and the money was approved. When Bush gave a speech at AIPAC in May 2004, in which he defended his Iraq policy, he received 23 standing ovations. At AIPAC's 2007 conference, by which time American public opinion on the war had soured, Vice President Cheney made the case for staying the course in Iraq. According to David Horowitz of the Jerusalem Post, he received, quote, considerable applause, unquote. And John Boehner, the House Minority Leader, received a standing ovation when he said, quote, who does not believe that failure in Iraq is not a direct threat to the state of Israel? The consequences of failure in Iraq are so ominous for the United States that you can't even begin to think about it, unquote. By contrast, when Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi criticized the Bush administration's quote-unquote surge strategy, many in the audience booed. AIPAC is not the only major group in the lobby to stick with Bush on Iraq, or at least not come out against the war. As the Forward reported in March 2007, quote, most Jewish organizations have refused to speak out against the war, and at times they displayed support for the administration, unquote. This behavior is especially striking given the attitudes of most American Jews towards the war itself. According to a 2007 Gallup organization study, based on the results of 13 polls taken since 2005, American Jews are significantly more opposed to the Iraq War, 77%, than the general American public, 52%. With respect to Iraq, the larger and wealthier pro-Israel organizations are clearly out of step with the broader population of American Jews. A few Jewish organizations such as the Tikkun Community and Jewish Voice for Peace opposed the war before it started and continue to do so today. But as noted in Chapter 4, these groups are neither as well-funded nor as influential as organizations like AIPAC. This gap between the political positions taken by key groups in the lobby and the public attitudes of American Jews underscores an essential point that deserves special emphasis. Although prominent Israeli leaders, the neoconservatives, and many of the lobby's leaders were eager for the United States to invade Iraq, the broader American Jewish community was not. In fact, Samuel Friedman, a journalism professor at Columbia University, reported just after the war started that, quote, a compilation of nationwide opinion polls by the Pew Research Center shows that Jews are less supportive of the Iraq War than the population at large, 52% to 62%, unquote. It would therefore be a cardinal error to attribute the war in Iraq to, quote, Jewish influence, unquote, or to, quote, blame the Jews, unquote, for the war. Rather, the war was due in large part to the lobby's influence, and especially its neoconservative wing. And the lobby, as we have emphasized before, is not always representative of the larger community for which it often claims to speak. Okay, we're at the bottom of page 243 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. The next section is called Selling the War to a Skeptical America. So Greg, should we continue? Should we read a little bit more of this, and then maybe we might have to just call it an evening. I'd like to sort of finish this chapter.
Let's how about we finish this chapter and then we can wrap up and we can go back to what the rest of what we want to do.
We'll do part 2.
Yeah. Let's finish this chapter if you're down to though.
All right, let's do it. Okay, we're at the bottom of page 243 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, a chapter titled Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. And this section is titled Selling the War to a Skeptical America. Quote, the neoconservatives began their campaign to use military force to topple Saddam well before Bush became president. They caused a stir in early 1998 by organizing 2 letters to President Clinton calling for Saddam's removal from power. The first letter, January 26, 1998, was written under the auspices of the Project for the New American Century and was signed by Elliott Abrams, John Bolton, Robert Kagan, William Crystal, Richard Pearl, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, among others. The second letter, February 19, 1998, was written under the auspices of the Committee for Peace and Security in the Gulf, the organization set up in 1990 by Pearl, Ann Lewis, the former political director of the Democratic National Committee, and former Congressman Stephen J. Solars, Democrat of New York, to lobby for the first Gulf War. It was signed by the individuals mentioned above who signed the first letter, as well as Douglas Feith, Michael Ledeen, Bernard Lewis, Martin Peretz, and David Wurmser, just to name a few. In addition to these high-profile letters, the neoconservatives and their allies in the lobby worked assiduously in 1998 to get Congress to pass the Iraq Liberation Act, which mandated that, quote, it should be the policy of the United States to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq and to promote the emergence of a democratic government to replace that regime, unquote. The neoconservatives were especially enthusiastic about this legislation, not only because it sanctioned regime change in Iraq, but also because it provided $97 million to fund groups committed to overthrowing Saddam. The main group they had in mind was the Iraqi National Congress, INC, which was headed by their close associate Ahmed Chalabi. Pearl, Wolfowitz, and Woolsey all lobbied hard on behalf of the legislation, as did Jinsa. The act passed in the House by a vote of 360 to 38 and by unanimous consent in the Senate. President Clinton then signed it on October 31st, 1998. Clinton had little use for the Iraq Liberation Act, but he could not afford to veto it because he was facing midterm elections and impeachment. Both he and his key advisors held Chalabi in low regard, and they did little to implement the law. In fact, by the time Clinton left office, he had spent hardly any of the allotted money for opposition groups like the INC. The president did pay lip service to the goal of ousting Saddam, but did little to make it happen, and he was certainly not considering using the U.S. military to drive the Iraqi dictator from power. In short, the neoconservatives were unable to sell the idea of war against Iraq during the Clinton years, although they did succeed in making regime change in Baghdad an official goal of the U.S. government. Nor were they able to generate much enthusiasm for invading Iraq in the early months of the Bush administration, even though a number of prominent neoconservatives held important positions in the new government and had lost none of their enthusiasm for the enterprise. Richard Pearl later said that the advocates for toppling Saddam were losing the arguments inside the administration during this early period. In fact, in March 2001, the New York Times reported that, quote, some Republicans, unquote, were complaining that Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, quote, are failing to live up to their pre-election advocacy of stepping up efforts to overthrow President Hussein, unquote. At the same time, the Washington Times ran an editorial titled, quote, have hawks become doves? Question mark, unquote. The text of that editorial was the January 26, 1998 PNAC letter to President Clinton. Given the publicity and the controversy surrounding two books published in 2004, Richard Clarke's Against All Enemies and Ron Susskind's The Price of Loyalty, one might think Bush and Cheney were bent on invading Iraq from the moment they assumed office in late January 2001. This interpretation, however, is wrong. Just a quick aside there, that then calls into question about the purpose of Richard Clarke's and Ron Suskind's writing after the fact. I've already pointed out in relationship to from 9/11 to 11/9 that I see a troika of dicks surrounding September 11th in an American context of Richard Dick Clarke, Richard Dick Cheney, and Richard Dick Pearl. So it's interesting for Mearsheimer and Walt to be sort of like they're pointing out that they're, they won't say it this clearly, but they're pointing out that it looks like someone like Richard Clarke is actually pushing some kind of disinformation about the early Bush and Cheney administration relationship to the Iraq War in relationship to pre-9/11, actually. All right, back to the text, unless you got a thought, Greg.
No, I was just going to have you go ahead, but it seems that at the very least, even if Bush wasn't, Cheney was, I think, in the know before September 11th that things were going to likely be going down, and was already in a position to benefit, as we'll get into when we get into the politics of oil, maybe the next part of this, where Cheney's interests overlapped with the politics of oil that we'll discuss in the next series. So I do think that particularly Cheney probably had some inclination that there were some things that were going to be potentially going down in the future. So anyway, we'll get to that later.
Well, it is the case that when Cheney was asked what his greatest moment or his most memorable moment of the entire years in the White House, he said, obviously it's got to be September 11th, So there's a deep id right there. All right, back to the text, page 245 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Quote, this interpretation, however, is wrong. They were certainly interested in toppling Saddam, but there is no evidence in the public record showing that Bush and Cheney were seriously contemplating war against Iraq before 9/11. Bush did not advocate using force against Saddam during the 2000 campaign, and he made it clear to Bob Woodward that he was not thinking about going to war against Saddam before 9/11. Interestingly, his main foreign policy advisor in the campaign, Condoleezza Rice, wrote a prominent article in Foreign Affairs in early 2000 saying that the United States could live with a nuclear-armed Iraq. Rice declared that Saddam's, quote, conventional military power, unquote, had been, quote, severely weakened, unquote, and said, quote, there need be no sense of panic, unquote, about his regime.
I don't want to go on too many sides here, but this is all interesting because, on the one hand, I do think that there was a cloak of insincerity, to say the least, regarding Bush's talk of humble foreign policy and all that, not looking for. But I do sense there's a veneer of insincerity around that. But it's interesting, Condoleezza Rice talking like this because, with relation to the bigger overall Bush administration, as problematic as Condoleezza Rice was in her role as Secretary of State. We actually had a chance to talk with her a little bit at the Kansas City Public Library a few years ago. I don't think she was too when she came to do a book event. But digressing, but she comes from she was actually a product of I believe, mentored by the quote unquote realist Brent Scowcroft, who was publicly against the Iraq War. And of course, there's a history, bigger context with somebody like a Brent Scowcroft than just that. But it is interesting that even going back to John Bolton, who's one of the biggest hawks of all, mentioned earlier in the book, Condoleezza Rice, like John Bolton went to the Israelis and was publicly telling Israeli officials or privately that Condoleezza Rice was against them. So you see this aspects, this foreign policy dispute playing out where Condoleezza Rice is saying we can live with a nuclear Iraq, but then she gets into the Bush administration where and seems to be as complicit as ultimately somebody like that was in the war crimes of the Bush era, ultimately at odds with these real hardliners who were really adamant about it, to the point where going from saying we could live with this to then ultimately, through maybe a combination of cowardice and complicity, end up not really doing anything about it. But still, there's this element that was involved with this administration that was not inclined to go down this direction of some of these really hardline policies. And so that's very interesting that you mentioned that. I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, and this points out, because of course Condoleezza Rice's whole public message changed after September 11th, right? Where the message then becomes, in relationship to the Iraq War, we can't wait for the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, right? That's her wording. So it's basically flipped on its head, which all points to the importance of continuing to get to the root of September 11th, which is actually the pivotal event here that helps lead up and does transform in some way, no matter whether, these protests again, for a humble foreign policy are in good faith or not. It created the de facto political situation for these kinds of aggressive wars to be launched, obviously.
A complete departure away from even any rhetorical belief in that stated philosophy.
Yes, exactly. Okay, page 245 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, Vice President Cheney maintained throughout the 1990s that conquering Iraq would be a major strategic blunder, and he did not sign either of the letters calling for military action against Saddam that the neoconservatives sent to President Clinton in early 1998. In the closing stages, it's sort of weird seeing Cheney as the resistant, the dove,
Well, something changed for sure.
All right. Okay, quote, in the closing stages of the 2000 campaign, Cheney, defended the 1991 decision not to go to Baghdad, in which he played a major role as Secretary of Defense, and said that, quote, we want to maintain our current posture vis-a-vis Iraq, unquote. There is no evidence to suggest that either his thinking or that of the president had changed significantly by early 2001. So then why did Richard Clarke and Ron Susskind say different, So this, I just want to point out that there's lots of levels when you're dealing with this level of international war criminality, that there's so many levels of cover in relationship to the information operations, that try to cloak it even after the fact. Whether it's the Iraq War or September 11th or any of these kind of big scale events. All right. Bottom of page 245 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt. In chapter 8, Iraq and Dreams of Transforming the Middle East. Okay, quote, there's no evidence to suggest that either his thinking or that of the president had changed significantly by early 2001. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who had signed both of the 1998 letters to President Clinton, appears to have been the only top-tier Bush administration official who may have favored war with Iraq upon taking office. None of the other groups that are sometimes blamed for the war, such as oil companies, weapons manufacturers, Christian Zionists, or defense contractors like Kellogg, Brown, and Root, were making noise about invading Iraq at this time. In the beginning, the neoconservatives were largely alone. Yet as important as the neoconservatives were as the chief architects of the war, they had been unable to persuade either Clinton or Bush to support an invasion. They needed help to achieve their aim, and that help arrived on 9/11. Specifically, the events of that tragic day led Bush and Cheney to reverse course and become strong proponents of a preventative war to topple Saddam. Robert Kagan put the point well in an interview with George Packer, quote, "September 11 is the turning point, not anything else. This is not what Bush was on September 10th, unquote." The neoconservatives, most notably Scooter Libby, Paul Wolfowitz, and the Princeton historian Bernard Lewis, played a critical role in persuading the president and vice president to favor war. For them, 9/11 was the new context to sell their old view of American foreign policy. Possibly their greatest advantage was that they had, in Kagan's words, quote, "a ready-made approach to the world," unquote, at a time when both the president and the vice president were trying to make sense of an unprecedented disaster that seemed to call for radically new ways of thinking about international politics. Wolfowitz's behavior is especially revealing. At a key meeting with Bush at Camp David on September 15th, 2001, Wolfowitz advocated attacking Iraq before Afghanistan, even though there was no evidence that Saddam was involved in the attacks on the United States and bin Laden was known to be in Afghanistan. Wolfowitz was so insistent on conquering Iraq that 5 days later Cheney had to tell him to, quote, "stop agitating for targeting Saddam," unquote. According to one Republican lawmaker, he, quote, "was like a parrot bringing Iraq up all the time. It was getting on the president's nerves," unquote. Bush rejected Wolfowitz's advice and chose to go after Afghanistan instead. But war with Iraq was now regarded as a serious possibility, and the president tasked U.S. military planners on November 21st, 2001, with developing concrete plans for an invasion. Other neoconservatives were also hard at work within the corridors of power. Although we do not have the full story yet, there is considerable evidence that scholars like Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami of Johns Hopkins University played an important role in convincing Vice President Cheney to favor war against Iraq. Indeed, Jacob Weisberg, the editor of Slate, describes Lewis as, quote, "perhaps the most significant intellectual influence behind the invasion of Iraq," unquote. Cheney's views were also heavily influenced by neoconservatives on his staff, like Eric Edelman and John Hanna.
And just an aside on Bernard Lewis, he was the
Bernard Lewis you're talking about?
The man who helped popularize the phrase of, as it relates to the bigger O.
Wait, Greg, will you repeat what you're saying? I think my signal.
Bernard Lewis was the man who, interestingly enough, in the Atlantic now. Jeffrey Goldberg editing it. In 1990, he was the person who popularized the phrase "clash of civilizations." That goes back to the terror not just simply being a war based in the Middle East, but this global concept of the clash of the civilizations between the civilized West and the based in the outsiders. So that's Bernard Lewis. So in addition to really hard agitating for war in Iraq, Bernard Lewis is out there in his role in academia popularizing the phrase "clash of civilizations." So,
I'd forgotten about that. He was before the article and book of that name. Actually, you're right. Bernard Lewis is at the epicenter of that.
Preceded Samuel Huntington in the warning in writing "The Clash of Civilizations." So.
Very, very important point. Thanks, Greg. Okay, bottom of page 246 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Quote, "But surely the most important influence on the vice president was his chief of staff, Scooter Libby, who was one of the most powerful individuals in the administration and whose views on Iraq were similar to those of his close friend and longtime mentor, Paul Wolfowitz. Shortly after 9/11, the New York Times reported that, quote, some senior administration officials led by Paul D. Wolfowitz and I. Lewis Libby, are pressing for the earliest and broadest military campaign against not only the Osama bin Laden network in Afghanistan, but also against other suspected terrorist bases in Iraq and in Lebanon's Bekaa region, unquote. Of course, the vice president's position helped convince President Bush by early 2002 that the United States would probably have to take Saddam out. And one aside here is that it was also, I believe it was Donald Kagan and the other Kagan brother, not Robert, who were on C-SPAN.
I'm sorry, Frederick Kagan.
Fred Kagan, thank you, who is married to, what's her name, who's in the Biden administration, right? Victoria
Nuland.
Yes, and I'm not sure, is she in the Biden administration? I think she might.
No, I believe she's I don't know if she's directly involved. I know her name has been floated around in terms of potentially having some influence, but I don't think she's directly in the administration, but I'm not positive about that.
I think she started the consulting company with Blinken, actually, where Dennis Ross works too. I think that's the case, but we'll fact check that later. But meanwhile, Donald Kagan and Fred Kagan were on C-SPAN on September 12th of 2001, advocating for U.S. Military to go on the ground in Palestinian lands, basically. So that's another piece of this. And Robbie Martin dug that up for his documentary, A Very Heavy Agenda, actually. And so that's another piece of it. Like others of these neocons were actually making a direct pitch for U.S. troops directly to intervene in Palestine. Okay. Page 247 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. Quote, of course, the vice president's position helped convince President Bush by early 2002 that the United States would probably have to take Saddam out. Two other considerations show how profoundly important the neoconservatives inside the administration were for making the Iraq War happen. First, it is no exaggeration to say that they were not just determined, they were obsessed with removing Saddam from power. As one senior administration figure put it in January 2003, quote, I do believe certain people have grown theological about this. It's almost a religion that it will be the end of our society if we don't take action now, unquote. A Washington Post journalist described Colin Powell returning from White House meetings during the run-up to the Iraq War, quote, rolling his eyes, unquote, and saying, quote, geez, what a fixation about Iraq, unquote. Bob Woodward reports that Kenneth Edelman, a member of the Defense Policy Board, quote, said he had worried to death as time went on and support seemed to wane that there would be no war, unquote. Second, there was little enthusiasm for going to war against Iraq inside the State Department, the intelligence community, or the uniformed military. Although Secretary of State Powell ultimately supported the president's decision for war, he believed that it was a bad idea. The rank and file in his department shared his skepticism. There were two key outliers in the State Department, however, John Bolton and David Wurmser, both prominent neoconservatives who had close ties to the White House. George Tenet, the head of the CIA, also supported the White House on Iraq, but he was not a forceful advocate for war. Indeed, few individuals within the intelligence community found the case for war convincing, which is why, as discussed below, the neoconservatives established their own intelligence units. The military, especially the army, was filled with Iraq skeptics. General Eric Shinseki, the army chief of staff, was severely criticized by Wolfowitz, who dismissed Shinseki's estimate of the necessary troop levels required for the occupation as, quote, wildly off the mark, unquote, and later Rumsfeld for expressing doubts about the war plan. The war hawks within the administration were mainly high-level civilians in the White House and the Pentagon, almost all of whom were neoconservatives. They lost no time making the case that invading Iraq was essential to winning the war on terrorism. Their efforts were partly aimed at keeping pressure on Bush and partly intended to overcome opposition to the war inside and outside of the government. On September 13th, 2001, JINSA put out a press release titled, quote, "This goes beyond bin Laden," unquote, which maintained that, quote, "A long investigation to prove Osama bin Laden's guilt with prosecutorial certainty is entirely unnecessary. He is guilty in word and deed. His history is the source of his culpability. The same holds true for Saddam Hussein. Our actions in the past certainly were not forceful enough, and now we must seize the opportunity to alter this pattern of passivity," unquote. 1 week later, on September 20th, a group of prominent neoconservatives and their allies published an open letter to Bush telling him that, quote, "Even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the 9/11 attack, any strategy aiming at the eradication of terrorism and its sponsors must include a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq," unquote. The letter also reminded Bush that, quote, "Israel has been and remains America's staunchest ally against international terrorism," unquote.
And I'll bring up here once again, reiterate something we've talked about in previous programs, as this full-on propaganda blitz basically begins right after September 11th by some of the leading these domestic elements you're mentioning here. It's also mentioned that once again, as we've talked about before previously on our program, on September 11, 2001 in and of itself, the aforementioned Ehud Barak, former Israeli prime minister, close with the whole Epstein operation, was on the BBC, basically almost seems to have a magic crystal ball, able to lay out what the post-September 11th world's going to look like in the war against terrorism. And so you've got that going on as you've got the domestic propaganda blitz going on. You've got Ehud Barak on international television on the morning of September 11th while people are still in shock trying to figure out what's going on in New York City, basically laying out a blueprint for a post-September 11th world. So.
Yes. All right. Okay. So we are at page 248 of the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt. And, okay. Okay. Got it. All right. Quote, "Little more than a week later, on September 28th, Charles Krauthammer argued in the Washington Post that after we were done with Afghanistan, Syria should be next, followed by Iran and Iraq. Quote, "The war on terrorism," he argued, "will conclude in Baghdad when we finish off the most dangerous terrorist regime in the world," unquote. Shortly thereafter, in the October 1st issue of the Weekly Standard, Robert Kagan and William Crystal called for regime change in Iraq immediately after the Taliban was defeated. Other pundits like Michael Barone in U.S. News and World Report were arguing even before the dust had settled at the World Trade Center that, quote, "Evidence is accumulating that Iraq aided or perhaps planned the attack," unquote. Dang. All right. Over the next 18 months, the neoconservatives waged an unrelenting public relations campaign to win support for invading Iraq. On April 3rd, 2002, they released yet another open letter to Bush, which clearly linked Israel's security with a war to topple Saddam. The letter starts by commending the president for his, quote, "strong stance in support of the Israeli government as it engages in the present campaign to fight terrorism," unquote. It then argues that, quote, "the United States and Israel share a common enemy," unquote, and are, quote, "fighting the same war," unquote. It urges Bush, quote, "to accelerate plans for removing Saddam Hussein from power," unquote, because otherwise, quote, "the damage our Israeli friends and we have suffered until now may someday appear but a prelude to much greater horrors," unquote. The letter concludes with the following message, quote, "Israel's fight against terrorism is our fight. Israel's victory is an important part of our victory. For reasons both moral and strategic, we need to stand with Israel in its fight against terrorism," unquote. The basic aim of the letter was to portray Arafat, bin Laden, and Saddam as critical parts of a looming menace that threatened both Israel and the United States. Not only did this depiction of a shared and growing danger justify close relations between America and Israel, it also justified the United States treating these three individuals as mortal enemies and backing Israel's hardline response to the Second Intifada. As noted in the previous chapter, relations between the Bush administration and the Sharon government were especially contentious in early April 2002 when the letter was written. The signatories included Kenneth Edelman, William Bennett, Linda Chavez, Elliot Cohen, Midge Decter, Frank Gaffney, Raoul Mark Gerecht, Donald Kagan, Robert Kagan, William Crystal, Joshua Moravchik, Martin Peretz, Richard Pearl, Daniel Pipes, Norman Podhoretz, and James Woolsey, among others. Other pro-Israel pundits who are not normally thought of as neoconservatives offered a steady drumbeat of pro-war advocacy as well. The case for war got a major boost with the publication in 2002 of Kenneth Pollock's ominously titled The Threatening Storm, which argued that Saddam was too risk-acceptant and irrational to be deterred, and concluded that preventative war was the only realistic option. Because Pollock was a former Clinton administration official who had previously called ousting Saddam the, quote, rollback fantasy, unquote, his conversion to a pro-war position seemed especially telling despite the book's tendentious treatment of evidence. Pollock moved from the Council on Foreign Relations to Brookings Sabin Center for Middle East Policy during this period, where he and Sabin Center Director Martin Indyk produced a number of op-eds and commentary in the months before the war, warning that Saddam was undeterrable, the UN inspections were no solution, and that however regrettable, force would almost certainly be necessary.
And of course, Haim Sabin is probably the key
or
Democratic.
Saban, right?
Saban is perhaps the key Democratic big money pro-Israel donor influence man as far as like the Democrats' version of Sheldon Adelson. I believe he has expressed himself as a single issue person. His issue is Israel, and he is probably he's the Democratic equivalent of Sheldon Adelson. So if we're looking for reason why Democrats are constantly in support of these pro-Israel policies, that Haim Saban would be one of the very key reasons for that. So,
yeah, I mean this is sort of like the Democrat version of the Condoleezza Rice flip at some level, which is very interesting. Like where he goes from being part of the Council on Foreign Relations and against the quote unquote rollback fantasy. He must have read Clean Break, but he confused Syria and Iraq, I imagine. But and then he goes to Sabin Center, and everything changes. And then he works with Sabin Center Director Martin Indyk, who was looked at as, a potential candidate for mega Israeli spy in the White House during those Clinton years, apparently. And what's interesting, too, is like some of the debates over this book involved the most serious debate actually involved he and Dennis Ross were the main people pushing back against it. I'm talking about Indyk, yeah. All right. Back to the book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Mearsheimer and Walt, page 249. Quote, the neoconservatives and their allies deployed the same arguments and almost the same language that the Israelis used to promote the war. The neoconservatives made frequent references to the 1930s and Munich, comparing Saddam with Hitler and opponents of the war like Brent Scowcroft and Senator Chuck Hagel with appeasers like Neville Chamberlain. Israel and the United States, they maintained, were facing a nebulous common enemy, quote-unquote international terrorism, and Iraq, to quote the New York Times columnist William Safire, was, quote, the center of world terror, unquote. The war hawks portrayed Saddam as an especially aggressive and reckless leader who would not only use weapons of mass destruction against the United States and Israel, but would also pass them on to terrorists. Identifying diplomacy and multilateralism with weakness, neoconservative commentators had nothing but contempt for the UN, and its inspectors in Iraq, not to mention France. Indeed, they repeated the old Israeli adage that force has great utility in the Middle East, because it is a region where, to quote Krauthammer, quote, power above all commands respect, unquote. One might argue that this analysis exaggerates the impact that open letters to presidents, newspaper columns, books, and op-eds can have on the policy-making process. After all, relatively few people actually read the various open letters, and there were plenty of other articles, editorials, and op-eds written in U.S. newspapers that had nothing to do with Iraq. This perspective would be wrong, however. The signatories of the various letters written to President Bush and Clinton are powerful individuals who have connections and influence with important policymakers and lawmakers on Capitol Hill, some of whom they had worked closely with in the course of their careers. In fact, a number of the individuals who signed the earlier letters to Clinton, including Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Feith, became key policymakers in the Bush administration. Thus, the signatories of the letters written to Bush in the period between 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq were not shouting into a void. The same was true for journalists like Charles Krauthammer and William Safire, who wrote frequently about Iraq for two of the country's leading newspapers, The Washington Post and The New York Times, respectively. Their views were taken seriously by influential people inside and outside of the U.S. government, as were the articles that appeared in neoconservative magazines like the Weekly Standard. Indeed, these writings by outsiders worked to reinforce the arguments made by Bush administration insiders who shared their views on the need to invade Iraq. The underlying purpose of all these efforts was to define the terms of debate in a way that would facilitate an affirmative decision for war. By making war seem both necessary and beneficial, by portraying potential opponents as quote-unquote soft on terror, and by linking America's fate to Israel's through the repetition of familiar moral and strategic arguments, these efforts helped stifle serious discussion about the pros and cons of an invasion and were an important part of the broader campaign for war. Okay, the next section is the fixing the intelligence on Iraq. And then it goes in, was Iraq a war for oil? So, Greg, and then it goes into the lobby's role in remaking the Middle East in the conclusion. So I'm going to propose that we end it there for now, because the fixing the intelligence and then the question of the was Iraq a war for oil should best be read in conjunction with the Clean Break paper and Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler, which will fill in some of the gaps that are not mentioned in the Israel lobby. So if you're cool with that, good, Greg, I'm down to do a part 2 where we finish this off, and we'll do it again under Antidote Deep Core Text. Is that cool with you, Greg?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Yes, and so we'll have this out when we'll try to get around to it here the next few days before too long here. But I mean that sounds like a good idea. We can then pick up where we've left off here as far as what we're doing here with the 18th anniversary of this. I don't know. It's hard to describe the severity of what happened in words, but I mean it's our attempt here to try to revisit it and try to make sense of from what we can best see is like what actually went on, trying to dig through the varying reasons and justifications for war with where it seems that the direction actually seems to go in terms of who and what was behind this and why it still matters today, because it does still matter today and it's still central to so much of what what's going on in the world now. And I think the consequences of, will be there with this for, first of all, the human suffering, but then even outside of that, the effects that just in so many different ways are just going to be, they're not going to leave us anytime, certainly in the foreseeable future, and will still be there probably long after, you and I and the rest of us are no longer on this earth. So, I mean, it's hard to put it into words what the consequences of this catastrophe, but that's what we're trying to do here. So,
yes, and hopefully there can, at the very least, there can be some historical justice for such a crime that's ongoing in its devastating implications to human lives. But it's also very important to understand how these kinds of political operations are deployed and then how they are then covered up, even though it's, this book is a very, has a lot of weight to it. When this book came out, it was serious, and yet the implications of it have not even been pushed through even the anti-war progressive groups in a United States context. And it seems like it's really this Israel lobby thing there's so much issue there.
I believe even Chomsky was critical of the book, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you're right.
And that, of course, there's another can of worms to open up at some point.
Yeah.
Is Chomsky's deeper role, like in the historical nature of geopolitics and conversations and where they do and do not go. But that's not for here nor there. But I mean, it is interesting that you had the book get published, and this was around the time also when Jimmy Carter's book was published, Israel, Peace, Not Apartheid, big controversy. But then those controversies just go away, and you don't hear about them anymore.
Yes. All right. Well, until part 2 of Clean Break, the Israel lobby and the politics of oil in recognition of the anniversary of the Iraq War. This is Jeremy Rothkushel.
And Greg McCarran.
And this is Antidote Deep Cortex. And thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.